This is a recent article from Make It, which is talking about a young man who, from his teenage years, was on very shaky ground and eventually became a little bit of a higher earner than your average American. The average American makes around between 52 and 56,000 a year. This man is earning 105,000 a year, so just about doubling what most average Americans make. So it's a good example of what we can learn from both the mistakes that he made and, of course, the good decisions that he made to basically change his life, because he wasn't exactly on the best course as a young person. So his name is Richard. Says he grew up in Texas. This is with his mother, his brother, and his sister. Right, so he grew up from a single mother household, and we know typically how that goes for many young people who grow up without a father and just a mother, that typically those individuals are more on the impoverished side of the spectrum. So he lived in, basically went to school. It says he attended high school for 2 years, earned his GED, right? So he ended up dropping out of high school. You can see already starting on the bad road. Single mother, dropped out of high school, and then it says after 2 years he had to drop out because he couldn't cover, and he went to community college. And then again, we see the habit. After 2 years, he had to drop out because he couldn't cover the cost of one of his textbooks. Now, of course, people might say, well, this is a problem because the educational system is very expensive, as we'll go into. And he says that the textbook that got in my way was a psychology book, because they wanted the 10th edition and I bought the 9th. It was about $500. And of course, this is one of the many problems for young people, especially people who are on the poorer spectrum, is that the books, while there might be coverage for the tuition, there might not be enough coverage to pay for many of these textbooks that are overpriced. You've got a psychology book going for $500. I guarantee you that there's probably no difference between the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th edition of that book. Just like very similarly, when I went to nursing school, and they had, anatomy, physiology books, and they wanted the newest one, and I was like, well, did anatomy change from the 9th edition to the 10th edition? And that basically ended that conversation about why I needed to get that book. But some people might not be that outspoken to be like, I'm not going to leave class. This man did, because maybe his professor pressured him and said, you can't come to class with the 9th edition. We want that 10th edition, because it's basically a racket. Moving on, and it says at that time, he says, I was 19. I couldn't afford it. Now, of course, obviously his mother couldn't either, being a single mother raising 2 kids. He says, I couldn't muster up the money to get it. And if he really wanted to, he could have gone out there and put in a hard day of work, or a hard week, or a hard month to get that textbook that he needed, and applied himself in advance before going to school. But again, one of the poor habits that he showed early on was that he was not necessarily a hard worker. Dropped out of high school, dropped out of community college, and we'll see later on that he made some more mistakes. And this typically happens. It looks like he's a young minority, might be Hispanic. And it goes on to say, I was very disappointed because I really, really wanted to get my associate's degree. I think it was maybe 3 credits away from it, and it crushed me. And again, 3 credits away, he really could have put in the work. He really could have gone and worked hard to get that textbook if he really wanted to graduate. But it just goes to show a habit of poor decisions as a young person. He says, I didn't know what to do. And my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, she had just found out she was pregnant. And you just don't find out that you were pregnant. Obviously, he was not using protection, having sex before marriage, having sex while he's not in a position. He's 19 years old. He's a teenager, and he's not in the position where if something happens, he's not able to provide for a family. So we see a lot of bad decisions early on in his early years that could have been devastating, and how many people, especially minorities, find themselves being impoverished, primarily related to a lot of the choices that they make. And he goes on to say, he says, so I really needed to push to get something done. I didn't want to not have a stable future. And I've said this before. It says when you look at why a lot of men nowadays don't earn as much as they could, usually it's because when you look at what drives a man, it's typically to provide for his family. And so now that he became a family man, he said, I have to step up to the plate to be able to provide for my now new family, for his girlfriend, and for his future child. And so he realized, I can't be the same individual that I was during my teenage years. I need in essence to get my act together. So he goes on to say, he says when he dropped out of college, it says he remembers his high school classmates teasing him, saying he wouldn't amount to anything. And that's the reality. Sometimes, the kids that you go to school with are going to be harsh towards you. And as a man, you realize that it is your responsibility. You have the burden of performance upon you. There's no safety net for men. Either you end up in jail, you end up dead, or you end up homeless. There's no safety net for most men. And so men have the burden of having to perform. And this is when he dropped out of college. He picked up work from a swimming pool construction company and earned $8.50 an hour. After a year, his pay increased to $17.50 per hour, but then the company faced financial difficulties and his pay was cut to $12. And then eventually his mother said, "Why don't you go speak to your father?" And so there's some interesting information that you can glean from. He says it recommended that he reconnect with his father, showing that maybe he was the one, because of maybe there was a nasty breakup. Maybe the mother didn't necessarily speak about the father in a favorable light. And so this typically happens. Most children end up with their mother separated from their father. And maybe the father wasn't spoken of in the best of light. And so she recommended, "Why don't you go reconnect with him?" And it goes on to say the outcome. It says, I was pretty nervous. When I called my dad, I didn't know what to say. So my icebreaker to my dad was, "Would you like to meet your grandson?" And so perhaps he was the one, maybe the father tried to have a relationship with his son after the breakup, but as he stated, he says, "I was nervous to speak to my father." If him and his father were on good terms, well, then he wouldn't be nervous. Obviously, there was a breach in the relationship between the children and the mother. And this typically happens where many women may unfortunately weaponize the children against the father, and then they lose out on all the benefits of having a father in your life to teach you much of the wisdom that men are forced by nature to acquire to be successful in the system. So he goes on to say, he says they met for dinner. His dad pointed him towards a plumbing apprenticeship. He says 10 years later, he says he's now a journeyman plumber, has 2 sons, and earns $105,000 a year. And so he saw the good outcome of taking the wise advice of his father. He said, "Go out there. You need to have a skill." And I've talked about that very often, that you need to have a skill, especially in these times where inflation is abounding and things might not look too good. And at the very least, now that he's a plumber, he can take that skill with him from town to town, city to city, state to state, and even if necessary, country to country. Because once you have that skill will be with you for the rest of your life. You can take it wherever you go, and you can use it to operate independently. This is the money is actually doing a lot of good for me and my family. It says my wife, she has had very, very, very expensive surgery coming up really soon. And he says, I've been able to put away enough for almost the entire surgery without insurance helping. So now you see a change in the mindset, where before he wasn't willing to put in the hard work just to get a $500 textbook. Now he's willing to put in the hard work to save up money for his wife's surgery. Now, of course, it doesn't go into what that surgery was. He says, I know money isn't everything, but wisdom has showed him that it helps. Now it goes on to say he's getting the job. It says when he started his plumbing apprentice, he earned $12 an hour, the same as when he was working construction, but quickly began to earn more. And typically what happens is when you're a good worker, you will move up as you become more valuable. You start to learn and acquire more skills on the job. You become more valuable to the person that you're working for. So now you have the opportunity to grow, or you have the opportunity to leave to another company where they will appreciate you, monetarily wise, for what you're worth. So he says, after 2 years, I earned my tradesman license. It says 2 years after that, he became a journeyman. It says in Texas, the testing process is in Austin. He says they have to do a whole bunch of things like solder, make glue points, cut cast iron, and they make sure that you know all the codes. He says now that he's earning $86 an hour as a plumbing and drain company. And he says a tradesman license allows you to work residential buildings, where a journeyman allows you to do both. He expanded his abilities and his skill set, and now he's able to work more avenues where he can draw revenue from. And it goes on to say, he says both residential and commercial. It says the master license here in Texas is more for if you're going to own your own company. So now he has the ability to move up and then expand now to opening his own business, if that was the route that he wanted to go. And so as you can see, now that he's applied himself, his family has benefited as a result. not only probably his mother and his sibling, but also, of course, the children that he has, and of course his wife. Now, I just did want to point to something you can see here. This is basically his family right here. He's got 2 sons, as he said, and you can see most men nowadays realize maybe women who have tattoos are not necessarily the woman in his elder years that he now might have wanted to attach himself. Obviously, early on in her life, she was very promiscuous, but so is he. And this is the mistake that many young men make. They get themselves ensnared, right? He gets himself involved with a wrong woman who offers him sex. He's immature, doesn't have a father to say, hey, don't do that. You're going to find yourself in trouble later on in life. You're going to have a kid that you maybe don't want or that you're not prepared for. But thankfully, he made the wise choice. But this is where we see where many young men early on, maybe if he had waited now where he was at right now, maybe he would pick a different woman. Maybe he would pick one that would be a better example. Maybe obviously he would have been a better example to his kids. But this just goes to show you that this, at the very least, is a life experience that did thankfully work out for the better. But you can easily see from the scenario how this could have ended and spiraled out of control, and these individuals could have ended up in poverty. She, again, basically following the same sort of system, where they would have had a breach in their relationship. She would be another single mother. He would be another distant father. And the cycle continued. And it's why the Bible specifically is against things like fornication and adultery, because these are typically the outcomes. Thankfully for this family, it did not work out that way. Of course, the reason that I bring this up is many people would be struggling nowadays, especially when it comes to making a living with regards to how the economy is doing. Many people are being paid to stay home and work and not really looking to put in solid days of work to earn a healthy living, to become more skillful, to become more useful to the person that they work for, or even venture out and start their own business. From my perspective as a nurse, one of the things that has helped me is, of course, becoming more skillful, from becoming maybe a regular med-surg nurse to working in step down, to eventually moving on to working with critically ill patients in the ICU, and then even further working towards getting your CCRN, right, your critical care license, your critical care certificate as an RN, and then maybe perhaps getting my triage, which is what I'm looking to do now. I'm looking to get my certificate in triage, and all these little things serve to make you that much more valuable, so that when someone is looking over, because I work as a travel nurse now, and so when someone looks over and this is my job history, what I offer, they might say, this person has a little bit more of a skill set. We should take that person instead of this individual. Or when I look at the pay and I say, that's not enough for me, which is what happened with my last gig. They said, we're going to offer you this much. And I said, that's not enough for me. Go back and tell them I want this. Otherwise, I don't want the job. And I was able to do that. Now, of course, when you work as a salary, that's all you get. You get your salary. And of course, you take your benefits, and you get the recurring pay of being a salaried employee. But if you go out there and venture on your own, you have a little bit more negotiation power. Now, of course, if you don't have any skills, or if the Bible made it really clear when it said that you become a skilled individual, it says you will find yourself stationed before kings. Those type of individuals don't starve because they're in high demand, right? Just like this individual, he could go out there and start his own business, and then who knows where his monthly income or yearly income would be. Maybe instead of being 105,000, maybe he's making 250 now. That makes a huge difference for his sons and what he's able to offer them, right? Nowadays we hear a lot of equality and equity, but a lot of it revolves around individuals just not wanting to put in the hard work to make changes from their family. This is a perfect example of where it could have gone sideways, and he could have said, hey, the system isn't fair. I couldn't afford this book. I grew up poor. And he could be jaded and be one of those individuals that are burning down your cities. But this is a good example of how to be quite the opposite. You can definitely take a look at the rest of the article, and I'll check you out next time. Thanks for watching. And of course, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what you think. And I'll see you next time.